welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, August 6th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Deion in Colorado. There was a very interesting article that came out from Athlon Sports that describe some not so great culture over there in Boulder, and I'll break down what exactly I mean in the first segment here. Then we'll get into the best thing that each conference has to offer in 2024, what I think is the absolute best thing that you're going to see from each conference and what could end up deciding each conference at the very end of the day. And then we'll get into players that need to make the most out of fall camp. We did this yesterday with the big four teams in the college football world. We're going to do 5 more today, so we'll break down that for you guys. Then we'll get into more fall camp updates. They just keep rolling in, so I want to make sure you guys are fully updated as they do. And then we'll finish it out with some conference questions. We're going to roll through every conference this week, get through all of the different questions I have as we get closer to week 1, some different ones that are going to have a ton to say about this upcoming year. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that is gsmcspodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about this Colorado article that came out from Athlon Sports, and it said some very aggressive things about Colorado, and especially what's happening behind the scenes and all of that different stuff, and there were a lot of very, very interesting things to pull from this. There were a lot of former players quoted, mainly former players quoted, which is why I'll kind of approach this with a little bit of a grain of salt. I don't want to necessarily jump on Colorado and, totally tear them apart right here, but there were some things that were named here that were not too great. I'll just leave it at that for the time being, but there was a ton of stuff that came out in this, and one of the big-time quotes that everyone's kind of taking and running with is, it's like a real-life Grand Theft Auto game. There are so many distractions with fights, guns, money floating around. The environment is unlike any I've come from before. And I actually believe that it's unlike any environment he's ever come from before. We know that Deion runs things differently. That's just the reality of Colorado. When you go there, it is going to be different than every other university in college football as of right this second. Now, some might end up heading more that direction. Maybe Colorado heads more back to the pack. But as of right this second, it is different. Now, the whole, it's like real-life Grand Theft Auto, I think is a little bit blown out of proportion. If you played Grand Theft Auto, you'd be shocked if a football program was operating that way. But at the end of the day, it's obviously something that, needs a little bit of attention. This is a former player that is saying that this is pretty much a clown show. There's a million things going on that have nothing to do with football and actually take away from what they can do on the football field. So this is obviously something that, frankly, I would be surprised if it was like Grand Theft Auto, because if it was, you'd see a lot more headlines coming out of Boulder, Colorado. But at the end of the day, it does kind of paint a picture of sorts of what's kind of going on there and kind of how everything is handled. But the real one I want to get into has to do with Cormani McClain. He was the very talented corner that was there and transferred after his freshman year. He is now at Florida after walking on there, and there have been a lot of stories around him. When he came to Colorado, there were stories from Deion himself, throughout camp and all that type of thing, saying he just wasn't doing what he had to do throughout last year to get on the field and play the amount of amount of snaps that someone like Travis Hunter did the year before him. So obviously that was been a big topic of conversation. That has obviously been something that has dominated a lot of what has happened around Colorado. Cormani McClain is now at Florida and seems to be doing a fine job there, although some people keep trying to say he's getting kicked off the team, although he's not. But there are definitely some things that happened at Colorado that seemed a little interesting, right? It definitely felt like he was not comfortable there. It definitely felt like something was wrong in the communication between him and the Colorado coaching staff. Well, it sounds like Cormani McClain was, as this former player puts it, was bullied by Shiloh Sanders. He says that Shiloh Sanders slapped him several times. It said it led to Cormani McClain running off the field, essentially screaming at everyone, being essentially blowing up at everyone, and he, from that point forward, was just not mentally on the team, was just not mentally there every day, and wasn't going to play the football that he's capable of playing. This is the one that is super serious to me. I think when you look at this team and you know that you know that Deion points in the direction of these star players, and frankly, every single coach in the country points in the direction of their star players. That's just the reality of this game, and it's the way that it likely should be. You have to make sure that your starting quarterback is handled probably before your third string corner, and that's just the way it is. But at the end of the day, there is a couple of things that, if this is 100% true, then we know a couple of things. One, this is a non-championship level culture, because the reality is every culture that is a championship level culture is player led. I don't care if it's, you can demand a lot of a guy. You can absolutely push him to be the best version of himself, and to push himself in practice, and to do some things that frankly a lot of us would not be willing to do. What you can't do is make physical contact with him. What you can't do is slap him during practice. What you can't do is hypothetically bully him during practice, which is what Shiloh Sanders is alleged to do in this scenario. That can't happen. I understand that football is an aggressive sport. I understand that there are guys that have to get after other guys because they're not putting in the effort that they have to. They can do it in other ways. It's just plain and simple. Every single other culture around the country that is really strong right now is not doing this. I can promise you that. Now, they're players that get upset with each other and maybe start shoving each other, a fight here and there, sure. But there absolutely is not a player that is outright bullying a kid and getting away with it. I can promise you that. I'm just telling you as plainly as I can that if this is what's happening at that school, and if Shiloh especially is not getting in trouble for it, this is not a championship level culture, and it never will be if this continues. Number two is Deion allows his sons to get away with stuff that he doesn't allow others to get away with. If he's going to allow, Shiloh to bully a kid, to straight up, make physical contact with a kid during a football practice that is outside the football realm, they're playing on the same side of the ball, so there's no world where they would have to be making physical contact with each other. So it's one of those things where we knew that he leans towards his sons. We know that that's going to be a big thing, especially Shadur is going to get a lot of love in that program, and they should. They're both really good players, and they both have a ton of say in what goes on in that program, especially Shadur. And so I'm not necessarily tearing down Deion for leaning towards his sons a little bit, because he should. They are his sons. There's no two ways about that. I'm not necessarily tearing him down for that, but you have to hold all your players to the same standard. I understand saying, my sons are going to be incredible players at the next level and they're going to do all these incredible things, because you should feel that way about your kids. What you shouldn't do is allow your kids to walk on the field and act differently than anyone else on that team, because you're setting the wrong example for everyone else. You're setting the wrong example for them when they go forward into the NFL. There's a million different problems with that. But if this is actually happening, and I want to say if every single time that I bring this up, because these are just quotes from a former player, and if we've learned anything, there are some former players that come from Colorado that are none too happy about what happened at Colorado and are willing to, I don't want to say lie because I don't know what the story is here, but definitely don't want to tear down Colorado by any means on the other side of this. So I'm going to try to play it as straightforward as I possibly can, but it doesn't change that if this is true, they have a couple of problems that are not going to be fixed necessarily anytime soon and would take some time to fix. The other big-time story that came out of this was around Jordan Seaton, the very talented five-star offensive tackle. It sounds like there was a little bit of fighting going on, and the way they put it was alleged bullied into proving his manhood, and he was decided to pick a fight with a former Colorado offensive lineman, Savion Washington, a very talented offensive lineman that played for them a lot of last year, and apparently they fought back in April, and it was a very, very bloody affair. It was very, gross, to be totally honest with you. So this is something that is insane. Plainly, if this is actually what's happening in that program, if that's actually what unfolds, this is gross. There's no two other ways to put it. I understand, maybe this isn't exactly how it went down, and frankly, I would be surprised if this is exactly how it went down. But at the end of the day, if this happened on your watch and you knew that you had two players fighting, it's insane, it's gross, it's everything in between. And all of these kids, they show their toughness on the football field. They show their toughness in the weight room. They show their toughness when they go out on Saturdays and they play that game. They don't need to show their toughness by fighting each other. I can promise you that they are plenty tough. And if they're not tough enough on the football field, then they don't play. That's the reality of this game. You don't need to prove it in the locker room. That's not a reality of any sport. So I think that's absolutely insane. Frankly, I think it's incredibly gross that that's even out there into the world. If it's true, then you have some real problems on your hands, and frankly, I think you would have to, there would be plenty of consequences. Let's just leave it at that for the time being. But there were also a couple of incidences around some recruits for Colorado. Ebenezer Boozy was a talented player that got arrested for battery and gun charges back this offseason, and Chidozie Nwanko, flashed a gun during his commitment to Colorado. These are something that I'm not going to put on Deion at all. I've talked about this a little bit, but there's only so much a college football coach can do, especially if the kid isn't even in your program yet. You can't necessarily stop that. I understand you want the right kids in your program, and maybe he's showing he's not the right kid, but that's something that I'm not putting on Deion. I'm not putting on Colorado, because at the end of the day, these kids are adults. They make their own decisions, and some of them make really, really bad decisions. So I refuse to use that as a moniker to throw in Colorado's face. But I have a million different questions coming out of this. And that's kind of the biggest thing here is when you're looking at this article, it has a million different crazy quotes and it has a million different things to kind of pull from and say, wow, all of this stuff is terrible and Colorado's doing everything wrong and the culture is terrible and dangerous and toxic. Whatever word you want to throw out there, it's very easy to say that. I have a million questions because if all of this is totally true, Colorado will never be a team that you have to worry about, period. They will never be a championship level roster. Frankly, Deion will be fired before the next 3 years. If some of this is true, you still have problems you have to fix within that culture. There's no two ways about that. Now, there's the other side of this. Maybe a kid was just really frustrated. Maybe a kid was, embellishing the truth to make it seem like this is a worse place than it is. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm also not saying that's not what happened. I'm not going to sit here and, tear apart Colorado's program with something that is just a quote from a player. I don't know all the details. I'm sure we will get more details, but also on the other side of this, Athlon isn't dumb. They are a news agency. They are a sports news agency. They understand that if they were to make false claims in this, then they could get possibly sued. Now, some of this is a little bit of a gray area because you are quoting someone else, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of different questions more than anything else. I think you look at this roster, you look at this program, and there's a lot of things to like. That talent level has gotten so much better since Deion has shown up, and he's done so many good things within that team when you talk about the football roster. There are questions behind the scenes. It seems like these stories come out about Colorado more often than they come out about pretty much anyone else, and I don't think it's necessarily coming from nowhere. How aggressive it is definitely needs to be found out, and it's definitely something that, kind of underscores some of the challenges that they could kind of shows maybe Coach Prime's leadership style is not the right way. Now, all of this depends on, how true all these statements are. So I'm not here to, tear down Colorado. I'm not here to act like Deion is, a horrifying person or putting these kids in really bad positions or encouraging these kids to do anything that's not right. I'm not here to do that. I won't do that until we absolutely know the facts around this. But it is a very interesting story, and it's one that we frankly have to talk about, and one that I think we'll know more about here in, a couple of months, possibly down the road a little bit. But it's troubling. At the very least, it's troubling to know that these are even stories that could come out, and if they're true, then you have some real problems at Colorado that, frankly, might not be fixed by this current administration. But we'll see what happens, obviously. We'll keep you updated with everything that comes out, because it is a rather explosive story that could end the entire era of Deion at Colorado. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about each conference, give you the best thing from each conference, maybe the thing that will decide each of these conferences. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.